Greetings everyone, my name is John Fia. I chair the history department here at Messiah College and teach American history, and welcome to the virtual office hours. I'm here as usual with the founding fathers and our producer behind the camera, Abby Blakeney. Hi Abby. And if you've been following the fall 2016 series, we've been talking about the course I'm teaching here at Messiah on the American Revolution. And we have been just sort of going through, I've been picking sort of at random various documents and various things that we have been discussing in the class. And we are slowly sort of moving through, we're just kind of wrapping up the 1760s and moving into the 1770s. And last couple of class periods, we've been talking about the colonial resistance to the Townshend Acts. These are duties that were placed upon luxury items like tea, lead, paint, glass, and some other luxury items that the colonists didn't necessarily need in order to live, like some of the papers they had to have a stamp on a couple of years earlier during the Stamp Act. But nevertheless, they were things that had become part of their life as British members of the British kind of provincial world. Remember, the colonists are living in a consumer culture, consumer revolution, in which there's this proliferation of British goods available to them, and these kinds of consumer goods also help to define their identity as British people. So when we read things about the Townshend duties, we talked a lot about consumerism and the way in which boycotts, non-importation agreements, and so forth were a way of kind of articulating a movement towards reform within the British Empire, and then eventually down the road, independence. But in one of the sort of famous documents written in resistance to the Townshend duties, and I think one of the more overlooked documents in this period, we don't spend too much time on that, but this is John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written in 1768, a series of letters from Dickinson protesting or showing why resistance to the Townshend duties was necessary during this period. And we read several of the letters. We don't have time to go into all of them, but the one we really focused on in class, last class, and even today in class, was the Dickinson's focus on the concept of virtue. And it's really in these letters of Dickinson that this concept of virtue becomes front and center in the American Revolution and its coming. Dickinson writes, for example, some states have lost their liberty by particular accidents, but this calamity is generally owing to the decay of virtue, he says. A people is traveling fast to destruction when individuals consider their interests as distinct from those of the public. Such notions are fatal to their country and to themselves. Yet how many are there so weak and sordid as to think they perform all the offices of life, if they earnestly endeavor to increase their own wealth, power, and credit, without the least regard for the society under the protection of which they live? Who, if they can make an immediate profit for themselves by lending their assistance to those whose projects plainly tend to the injury of their country, and then he goes on and on. We'll kind of have an ellipsis there on the screen. So again, here's the idea of virtue, right? Virtue in the 18th century is very much a political idea. A virtuous person is someone who sacrifices their own interests, whether they be political interests, economic interests, for the greater cause. And in this case, Dickinson is saying, here's your self-interest, right? I have to have my tea. I have to paint my house. I need to buy glass for this or that reason. But now, in order to make this resistance movement to the British taxation plan work, we need to have people willing to make sacrifices, to lay aside, as he says, their own wealth, power, credit for this greater movement. So again, 18th century virtue, very much a political idea. Today we often think of virtue much more sort of in a post-Victorian way, right? Virtue has to do with morality, or it's usually a feminine quality. In the 18th century, it's very much a masculine quality, and it's something essential, according to John Dickinson, for this sort of revolutionary movement, or at least this resistance to the British tax plan, to move forward. So again, we don't normally think of this concept of virtue when we think about the coming of the revolution and the establishment of a kind of revolutionary coalition, a patriotic coalition. But there it is, front and center in John Dickinson's response to the Townshend duties. So there's our lesson for today. We'll see you next time on the Virtual Office Hours.